The sky over the Pacific was a nightmare of fire and steel. December 1944, a wave of Japanese kamikaze aircraft screamed toward the American cruiser USS Helena, their pilots ready to die in a final act of destruction. The ship's anti-aircraft guns roared to life, but something was different this time. Shells weren't just flying past the diving planes. They were exploding with impossible precision, tearing wings and fuselages apart in midair, as if guided by some invisible hand. In the space of minutes, every single attacker was destroyed before reaching the ship. The Japanese pilots who survived to report back spoke of a terrifying new American weapon, one that seemed to know exactly when to detonate. Some whispered that the Americans had made a deal with dark forces. Others believed a demon was adjusting every single shell in flight. The truth was stranger than any supernatural explanation. It was a tiny glass tube, smaller than a man's thumb, that had changed the face of warfare forever. If you're fascinated by the secret technologies that shaped the Second World War, subscribe to this channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from today. To understand why this invention was so revolutionary, we need to step back into the world of anti-aircraft gunnery before 1942. Shooting down an airplane with an artillery shell was, to put it bluntly, an exercise in calculated frustration. A gunner would spot an incoming aircraft, estimate its speed, altitude, and direction, then perform a series of rapid mental calculations. He had to figure out where that plane would be several seconds in the future when his shell finally reached that patch of sky. Then he had to set a mechanical time fuse on the shell, twisting a dial to determine exactly how many seconds the shell should fly before exploding. If his calculations were perfect, the shell would detonate close enough to the aircraft for the shrapnel to do damage. If he was off by even a fraction of a second, the shell would explode harmlessly, either too early or too late, while the plane flew on untouched. The statistics were brutal. During the early years of the war, it took an average of over 2,000 anti-aircraft shells to bring down a single enemy aircraft. 2,000 shells. Each one manufactured, transported, loaded, aimed, and fired, all for a single kill. The mathematics of attrition were simply unsustainable. The problem haunted military planners on both sides of the Atlantic. How could you make a shell smart enough to know when it was close to a target? The theoretical answer had existed since the 1930s. Radio waves. If you could put a tiny radio transmitter inside a shell, it would send out a signal that would bounce off nearby objects and return. By measuring the strength of the returning signal, the fuse could determine when it was close to something solid, like an aircraft, and detonate automatically. No guesswork, no manual timing. The shell itself would decide when to explode. The concept was elegant. The execution was thought to be impossible. A radio transmitter required vacuum tubes, delicate glass bulbs filled with heated filaments. These tubes were the hearts of every radio in existence. They were also notoriously fragile. A sharp tap could crack the glass. A sudden jolt could snap the filaments, and a shell, fired from an anti-aircraft gun, experienced forces that would crush a human being. The moment of firing subjected the shell to accelerations exceeding 20,000 times the force of gravity. Temperatures inside the gun barrel spiked to extremes that would melt most metals, and the shell spun at thousands of revolutions per minute as it flew, generating centrifugal forces that would tear apart any conventional electronic component. Every engineer who examined the problem came to the same conclusion. You could not build a vacuum tube that would survive being fired from a gun. The British had been working on the concept since 1939, but progress was agonizingly slow. When America entered the war after Pearl Harbor, the project was handed to a team of scientists working under the newly formed Office of Scientific Research and Development, led by a physicist named Merle Tuve. His laboratory was located at Johns Hopkins University, hidden in plain sight among academic buildings. The challenge he faced was not just technical, it was existential. Every kamikaze that got through, every bomber that reached its target, represented lives lost and ships sunk. The pressure to deliver a working proximity fuse was immense. Tuve assembled a team that read like a who's who of American physics and engineering. They attacked the problem from every angle simultaneously. The vacuum tube issue was the first and most critical. If they couldn't make a tube that survived firing, nothing else mattered. The solution came from an unexpected direction. Instead of trying to make a stronger tube, they redesigned the tube to be smaller, much smaller. The smaller the tube, the less material there was to be stressed by acceleration and vibration. They developed tubes barely larger than a peanut, with filaments thinner than human hair, encased in specially formulated glass that could flex slightly under stress without shattering. But small size created its own problems. The filaments had to be heated to function, and heating required a battery. How do you make a battery that survives 20,000 gravities and then works perfectly the moment it's needed? The answer was a wet cell battery that activated only upon firing. The shell contained a glass ampule filled with electrolyte. When the gun fired, the brutal acceleration shattered the ampule, allowing the liquid to flood into the battery cells and generate power. The very force that would destroy a conventional battery was harnessed to activate this one. It was engineering judo, using the enemy's strength against itself. But even with working tubes and batteries, the fuse needed to be reliable. Military procurement officers demanded that at least 70% of fuse work correctly under combat conditions. This was an almost impossibly high bar for something so complex being manufactured in the millions. Every fuse contained over 130 individual components, each one of which had to be assembled with watchmaker precision. A single bad solder joint, a single cracked tube, a single misaligned connection would render the entire device useless. The solution was a manufacturing revolution that presaged the electronics industry of the post-war era. Assembly lines were set up that employed thousands of workers, many of them women who had never held a soldering iron before the war. They were trained to assemble the fuses with robotic consistency, following procedures designed to minimize human error. Quality control was obsessive. Random samples were pulled from every batch and tested under conditions that simulated firing. Fuses were spun in centrifuges, frozen, heated, dropped, and vibrated. Only batches that met the 70% reliability threshold were shipped to the fleet. This sounds straightforward in retrospect, but remember that no one had ever tried to mass-produce miniaturized electronics before. The Proximity Fuse project became the second most expensive research and development effort of the entire war, exceeded only by the Manhattan Project that created the atomic bomb. And unlike the atomic bomb, the Proximity Fuse saw extensive combat use, its existence hidden from the public and from the enemy by a wall of secrecy almost as impenetrable as that surrounding nuclear weapons. The fuse worked on a principle called Doppler shift, the same phenomenon that makes a car horn seem to change pitch as it passes you. The tiny transmitter in the nose of the shell broadcast a continuous radio signal. When that signal struck a nearby object, it bounced back. If the shell was approaching the object, the reflected signal would be compressed, its frequency slightly higher than the original. The fuse's receiver detected this frequency shift. As the shell got closer to the target, the shift increased. When the shift reached a predetermined threshold, indicating that the shell was within lethal radius of something solid, the fuse triggered detonation. The beauty of the system was its simplicity once the engineering hurdles were overcome. There were no complex computers, no guidance systems, no moving parts beyond the firing circuit. The fuse simply listened for the echo of its own voice and acted when that echo told it the moment was right. The system was so elegant that it worked against targets the designers had never specifically intended. Aircraft, certainly. but also the ground itself. And this led to the fuse's second equally devastating application. When a conventional artillery shell struck the ground, it buried itself before detonating. Much of the explosive force was directed downward, into the dirt, wasted. Shrapnel flew outward in a cone, but anyone lying flat on the ground was relatively protected. The proximity fuse changed this equation entirely. A shell equipped with the fuse would detonate not upon impact, but at a preset height above the ground, typically around 15 to 20 meters. The explosion occurred in midair, and the shrapnel rained straight down, covering a much larger area. Soldiers in foxholes, behind low walls, in shallow trenches, none of them were safe from this iron rain from above. The killing radius of a single shell increased dramatically. What had taken multiple impacts to achieve now required only one. When the fuse was finally authorized for use over land during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, German soldiers reported that the American artillery seemed possessed. Shells were exploding with perfect timing, regardless of terrain or concealment. Some units reported casualties of 50% or higher from artillery alone. German intelligence officers were baffled. They recovered fragments of exploded shells and examined them carefully, but the fuse destroyed itself upon detonation, leaving only twisted scraps that revealed nothing about how it worked. Without an intact example, they could only speculate. Some theorized that the Americans had developed an optical fuse that detected shadows on the ground. Others believed it was a barometric device that measured air pressure. The truth remained hidden until after the war, when captured German scientists expressed disbelief that such a device could be mass-produced. They had explored similar concepts, but dismissed them as impractical. Meanwhile, if you're finding this deep dive into secret weapons technology fascinating, this is a perfect moment to consider subscribing. A single click helps this channel continue bringing you these untold stories from history's most devastating conflict. The secrecy surrounding the proximity fuse was extraordinary, even by wartime standards. The device was classified under a code name that revealed nothing about its function. Official documents referred to it only as the VT fuse, with VT supposedly standing for variable time. This was deliberate misdirection. The name implied the fuse was simply an improved version of the existing time fuses, nothing revolutionary, nothing worth investigating. American servicemen who used the fuses were forbidden from discussing them with anyone, even other military personnel not directly involved with the weapons. Shore leave was canceled for sailors on ships equipped with VT-fused ammunition before major operations. The fear was constant that a single loose word in a bar or a letter home might reach enemy ears. When VT-fused shells were used over water, the spent shell casings sank to the bottom beyond enemy recovery. But land use was far more dangerous from a security standpoint. An unexploded shell or even a partially destroyed fuse could be recovered by the Germans and reverse engineered. For this reason, the fuse was restricted to naval use until the desperate situation in the Ardennes forest overrode security concerns. Even then, strict rules governed its employment. The fuses were not to be used within a certain distance of enemy-held territory where they might be recovered. Artillery units using VT-fused ammunition were ordered to switch to conventional fuse if there was any possibility of shells falling into enemy hands. Specialized teams were dispatched to recover unexploded rounds whenever possible. The effect on enemy morale was profound. Japanese pilots who survived encounters with VT-fused anti-aircraft fire reported that the American shells seemed to seek them out, detonating with malevolent intelligence at exactly the wrong moment. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical damage. Pilots hesitated. Attacks were pressed home with less determination. The knowledge that something unnatural was waiting for them in the American gunsmoke eroded fighting spirit in ways that raw casualty figures cannot fully capture. German soldiers in the Bulge experienced similar demoralization. Veterans who had survived years of artillery bombardment found themselves facing something entirely new. The standard survival tactics, digging in, staying low, seeking cover, no longer worked. Death came from directly above, inescapable. The story of Sergeant Arthur Collins illustrates the fuse's impact at the individual level. Collins commanded an anti-aircraft battery protecting a naval installation in the Pacific. Before the VT fuse arrived, his crews would spend an entire day's ammunition allocation trying to down a single reconnaissance plane. After receiving the new ammunition, marked with a distinctive blue band to distinguish it from conventional rounds, his battery shot down 3 aircraft in a single engagement. Collins later wrote in his memoirs that the first time he saw those shells detonating perfectly, bracketing an incoming plane with lethal precision, he felt he was watching something supernatural. His loaders, young men barely out of high school, crossed themselves and muttered prayers. None of them understood the science behind what they were witnessing. They only knew that the new shells worked in ways that defied everything they thought they understood about gunnery. The manufacturing scale of the proximity fuse program is difficult to comprehend in modern terms. By the end of the war, over 22 million VT fuses had been produced. Each one contained roughly 130 components, meaning the total parts count reached into the billions. The program employed over 200 companies as subcontractors, with final assembly conducted at multiple sites under conditions of strict compartmentalization. Workers at one factory might produce the miniature vacuum tubes without knowing what they were for. Another facility manufactured the batteries. A third assembled the firing circuits. Only at final assembly were the pieces brought together, and even then, workers were told only what they absolutely needed to know. The program's security record was remarkable. Despite thousands of workers, despite millions of fuses shipped across the Pacific and Atlantic, despite combat use on multiple fronts, the Germans and Japanese never obtained an intact example before the war's end. The first significant use of the proximity fuse came in January 1943, when the cruiser USS Helena used VT-fused ammunition against Japanese aircraft during the Solomon Islands campaign. The results were immediately impressive. Aircraft that would have required dozens of shells to hit were now falling to 3 or 4. The kill ratio improvement was not incremental, it was transformational. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the South Pacific Fleet, sent an urgent request for every VT fuse that could be produced. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, sometimes called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, saw Japanese naval aviation effectively destroyed as a fighting force. While American carrier aircraft deserved much of the credit, the anti-aircraft screens around the fleet, now heavily equipped with VT-fused ammunition, made approaching the American ships a death sentence for Japanese pilots. But the proximity fuse's role in the Pacific was actually secondary to its impact in another theater. The defense of Britain against the V-1 flying bomb campaign demonstrated the fuse's capabilities in a context that saved thousands of civilian lives. The V-1 was a small, fast, pilotless aircraft carrying an 850-kilogram warhead. It flew at altitudes below most fighter interception ranges and at speeds that made it difficult to track with conventional anti-aircraft fire. When the V-1 assault began in June 1944, British anti-aircraft defenses were achieving a kill rate of approximately 24%. Nearly 3 out of 4 flying bombs were getting through to their targets, primarily London. The carnage was devastating. Entire city blocks were leveled by the explosions. The civilian death toll mounted daily. American VT fuses were rushed across the Atlantic and distributed to the anti-aircraft batteries defending the southern approach to London. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Within weeks, the kill rate climbed to 74%. By the end of the V-1 campaign, some batteries were achieving rates above 90%. A weapon that had threatened to make London uninhabitable was rendered largely ineffective by a small glass tube and the circuitry surrounding it. Winston Churchill personally acknowledged the fuse's contribution, though in characteristically guarded language that revealed nothing about how it actually worked. He simply noted that British air defenses had benefited from certain scientific advances that had dramatically improved their effectiveness. The true story remained classified for years after the war's end. The fuse's use in the Battle of the Bulge has already been mentioned, but the full story deserves more detail. In December 1944, Germany launched its last major offensive in the West, striking through the Ardennes forest with the goal of splitting Allied forces and capturing the vital port of Antwerp. The initial assault achieved complete surprise, and American units reeled backward under the onslaught. Some were surrounded, others were simply overwhelmed. The situation appeared dire, with memories of Dunkirk and the 1940 collapse looming in military minds. American artillery played a crucial role in stemming the tide, and for the first time, those batteries were authorized to use VT fuses in large quantities over land. The decision was not taken lightly. Security officers argued strenuously against it, pointing out that the Germans were certain to recover unexploded examples. But the tactical situation demanded every advantage available. German soldiers advancing through the snow-covered forests found themselves under a new kind of hell. Artillery had always been dangerous, but this was different. There was no warning, no time between impact and detonation to seek cover. The shell simply exploded overhead without warning, showering death from above. Medical units behind German lines reported unprecedented casualties from shrapnel wounds to the head and shoulders, exactly the pattern expected from airburst munitions. German commanders sent increasingly frantic reports to headquarters, describing American artillery that seemed to detonate by magic. Some reports used explicitly supernatural language, speaking of shells guided by unseen forces, of artillery directed by something inhuman. The psychological effect was cumulative. Troops who survived one barrage dreaded the next. Officers found it increasingly difficult to keep men moving forward when every step might place them under that invisible, inescapable fire. The fuse had another, less documented impact on the conduct of the war. Japanese kamikaze tactics, which began in earnest in the Philippines in late 1944, were partially a response to the impossibility of conventional attack against American fleet formations. Before the VT fuse, a determined pilot had a reasonable chance of pressing home an attack, scoring a hit, and surviving to fight again. The fuse changed that calculation. Survival became increasingly unlikely, regardless of skill or determination. If a pilot was going to die anyway, the reasoning went, better to die ensuring his bomb reached the target than to be shot down short of the goal. The kamikaze was thus partly a desperate adaptation to a technological revolution that had made conventional air attack suicidal. This connection is rarely discussed in popular histories, but it represents one of the war's more chilling examples of how weapons technology drives tactical evolution. The scientists who developed the proximity fuse received comparatively little public recognition after the war. The Manhattan Project captured public imagination with its apocalyptic implications. The proximity fuse, smaller and less dramatic, faded into technical obscurity. Yet those who understood its impact rated it among the war's decisive technologies. General George Patton, not a man given to praising those who worked behind the lines, called the proximity fuse one of the war's most important developments. Admiral Arleigh Burke, who would later become Chief of Naval Operations, credited it with saving hundreds of ships and thousands of lives. The fuse's principal developer, Merle Tuvey, returned to academic research after the war, his wartime work largely unacknowledged until decades later when historians began piecing together the classified story. The legacy of the proximity fuse extends far beyond the Second World War. The miniaturization techniques developed to make the fuse work became the foundation of modern electronics. The manufacturing processes pioneered in fuse production were directly applied to early computer assembly and later to integrated circuit fabrication. The basic principle of the fuse, using radio waves to detect nearby objects, evolved into radar proximity warning systems for aircraft, collision avoidance systems for automobiles, and countless other applications. Every time you use a device with automatic sensing capabilities, you are benefiting from technologies whose roots lie in the desperate wartime effort to make a shell smart enough to find its own target. The human stories behind the fuse are equally compelling, if less well known. The women who assembled the fuse in factories across America worked under conditions of secrecy that prevented them from understanding what they were building. Many learned only years later that the small tubes and circuits they had soldered together had been responsible for saving thousands of lives. Some received letters from servicemen thanking anonymous factory workers for the miracle ammunition that had protected their ships. These letters, kept as treasured mementos, were often the only acknowledgment these workers ever received. In the final weeks of the war in Europe, American forces overran several German research facilities and discovered documentation showing that German scientists had been pursuing similar proximity fuse concepts. Their conclusion, documented in captured memos, was that miniaturized electronics capable of surviving the forces involved in artillery firing were beyond the current state of the possible. They estimated that such a device might be developed within 10 to 15 years, making it a technology for the next war, not this one. They were wrong by exactly that margin. The American fuse had entered production 3 years before German scientists expected the concept to be feasible. That 3-year gap was measured in bodies. German bodies falling to shells that exploded at precisely the wrong moment. Japanese bodies torn apart by anti-aircraft fire that never missed. The mathematics of war are cold, but they are not abstract. Every technical advance translates into lives ended and lives saved, the proportions determined by which side achieved the breakthrough first. The proximity fuse remains in use today, though in forms far more sophisticated than those first deployed in 1943. Modern fuse use solid-state electronics rather than vacuum tubes, digital signal processing rather than analog circuits, and microprocessors that would have seemed like science fiction to Merle Tuve's team. But the basic principle remains unchanged. A shell that knows when to explode is infinitely more effective than one that must be told. The devil, it turns out, wasn't adjusting fire at all. It was American engineering applied under impossible pressure, achieving what experts said could not be done. The enemy simply had no framework to understand what they were facing. When the real explanation is sufficiently advanced, it becomes indistinguishable from the supernatural, and in the smoke and chaos of battle, the distinction hardly mattered. What mattered was that shells were exploding with impossible precision, and the soldiers on the receiving end had no defense, no counter, and no explanation. If you've made it to the end of this story, you understand why some secrets were worth keeping. Subscribe to join us for the next journey into history's hidden corners. Leave a comment with your thoughts on the proximity fuse. And until next time, remember that the most powerful weapons are often the ones nobody sees coming.